Hello, hello, good afternoon. Today I would like to do a review. Title is going to say Postmortem, but just a review of Porcfest 2019. It's Monday, the day after. I just got home yesterday. I was there from Monday until Sunday morning, uh, and I have some interesting thoughts about it. For those of you who don't remember, I started attending Porcfest, I believe, in 2011. I think was the first time that I went, and I attended 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015, and I think 2016. And then I did not attend 2017 or 2018, so I took a two-year hiatus that was work related. Prior to that, I think I'm not sure if I was aware of Porcfest for more than a year before my first going. And the first time I went was quite spur of the moment. I was working, and at that time I was working a great deal and did not have a lot of time to do vacations. I could never plan one. Uh, so it kind of just spur of the moment happened that I got off of work, and it was going to be a couple days, couple weeks, and so I went ahead and did it, and I mean, a really great time. It was really an interesting experience, a unique experience, one that I've never replicated in any other festival or anything. And so I made a point to go after that. And for the next, I don't know, 5 years, I guess, uh, I went every year. And then later, work slowed down, and so I couldn't really afford to not take work when it was offered. And so when it was offered in the previous 2 years, I chose work instead of Porkfest, to my great regret. Um, but uh, although I think I would have rather have gone to those Porkfests, um, it was interesting to have the perspective of having missed a few and to see some of the changes that might have been too subtle to catch if I've been going every year. I think are more observable, assuming that there are trends that continue on through time. Oh, hey Ron, nice to see you. So uh, and I don't think it's always correct to say that there are trends. Just because you observe something doesn't mean it's a trend. The last video I did after 2016 was called Porkfest Jumping the Shark. So there was a real sense from me and from other people that Porkfest had kind of jumped the shark in 2016. That in a lot of ways 2015 or 2014 were kind of the peak years, and then it had come down, at least in attendance, and also in kinds of the fervor people had. I think up to that point there had been, obviously there are always disagreements. Like you have a couple hundred or a couple thousand libertarians getting together. Obviously we don't agree with everything. We're not a monolith when it comes to ideology. In fact, it's an incredibly diverse amount of differences, but people agree on enough that it's one of those few places where you aren't going to argue. There's certain points that you don't have to argue about, and it's certainly refreshing from that perspective. But I think one of the main changes was the banning of Ian Freeman, Free Talk Live. I learned about Porkfest from Free Talk Live. Ian Freeman was a tireless promoter and supporter of of Porkfest and the Free State Project. And in the years that I went when he was there, the LRN studios and the shows, especially Free Talk Live, but also other shows, were kind of the centerpiece of a lot of what was going on. They were always going on in the background. I mean, you had the formal lectures and stuff, which were also quite interesting and thought-provoking and drew crowds and generated a lot of interesting discussion. But then kind of going on over the loudspeakers and there's a pavilion that you could go and sit. You always had Free Talk Live, and it just really made the event just an interesting. There was always something going on. There was always something to listen to. There was always a chance for a little media spotlight, which I think a lot of people do like. Everyone likes a little bit of fame, not everyone, but a lot of people. And so you never know, you could end up on Free Talk Live, and it was Free Talk Live that got me into Porkfest initially. And so with Ian getting banned, I think after 2015, there were a lot of people who were upset about that. A lot of people said so in 2016, and I think that I don't know what percentage of the people, I'm sure it's not a huge percentage, but a lot of people were upset by that, and some of them enough to not show up. But just on top of that, you just have kind of muted the biggest promoter. There's no question that Ian Freeman and Free Talk Live were the biggest promoters of the event. And there is a certain hypocrisy there of, um, Did I ever talk to Bitcoin Motorist? I don't believe so, but it's possible, and I just didn't know him by that handle. So, although Gregory, I did talk a lot about intactivism, I was very intactivistic about this Porkfest, which I'll talk to about in a minute here. But that was a big part of my Porkfest, was being an intactivist. So, uh, the video I titled back then was called "Porkfest Jumps the Shark?" ? Now, part of the problem was that I had just gone to many, and the more times you go to an event, in certain ways, it's very possible for it to lose some of its shock value. You know, the first time you see David Friedman, it's really cool, and you're amazed or whatever. But after you've heard a couple speeches and seen him for a couple years, the novelty kind of wears off. And the same can be said for any of the regulars. Jeffrey Tucker is there all the time. People like uh, who's the other one who comes a lot? He didn't come this year. Um, Austrian economist with the glasses. I forget his name. It doesn't matter, but like, yeah, and then seeing people open carry, that's great. I love seeing that, but you know, you see it every time, and it kind of goes down. So, uh, so this year going, it was interesting. A lot of old friends, a lot of people that I had seen at the previous festivals, some that I had not seen in quite a long time, that have also missed several years. There were a couple who had, for instance, started families. They had now had children. They had wives, and they, you know, weren't able to come as much, and there were a few who still managed to show up, and this was kind of their return. There were people who had gotten more professional, had other jobs, and now come back. A lot of my friends, there was quite a gay network that used to always go, and a few of those guys were still there. Derek Freeman, who is a fairly well-known gay libertarian, was certainly there. He's a bit of a fixture there, and I think I'll talk a little bit about him because I think he's kind of a good barometer of some of the changes that have happened. So it was interesting. Now, everyone that I talked to who had been there before and who chose to discuss the relative merits or demerits of Porkfest this year versus previous year said that it had declined. Now, what exactly that means wasn't always made explicit. I think obviously the most basic one was that there are few people there. It's still not a small event. It's not pitiful in any sense. I think there were somewhere in the many hundreds or 1,000 people there, but that is, I think, substantially less than it used to be. Yes, there were still crowds. They were still not empty by any means, but there were many fewer people. At night in the past, there were so many different campfires, each one with a congregation of people. The crowds around the main campfire were quite large. The attendance at the events, I mean, many of the events were standing room only. In the past, you go to the pavilion and you could not get a seat. And I don't think that even happened once this year. Even when the main speakers were there, even when the most entertaining, most promoted people talked, there were always chairs available. Now, I guess you could say that, well, maybe they just weren't as interesting this year, but I don't think that was it. I think that it was too consistent. And I just think you had fewer people shuffling around. And I don't think it's any secret that they went down. The other thing is like the number of vendors, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. There are way fewer vendors, or at least it seemed to be way fewer venues than previously. Now, I did all my eating at Porkfest. I did not eat in town one time. There's a town nearby, so if you really wanted to, you could go there. It's not a big town, but you certainly have options. And I ate all my food at Porkfest, but I really was restricted to just maybe 3 or 4 options, and there may have been 2 or 3, maybe 4 more that I didn't, that didn't strike my interest. But that's a pale comparison to what used to be available. There was some controversy. The organizers are charging more and more for tickets, which I think is just a clear way that fewer people will come. Right-wing authoritarians has sucked the oxygen out of libertarian fire. I don't know if that's true, Gregory. That's how right-wingers like to flatter themselves, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case, and that's certainly not the sense that I got here. So I don't know anyone other than what's his face, the guy who got arrested and cried like a baby. I don't remember his name, but you know who I'm talking about. He's the only one who's not there that I knew of anyway. But basically the organizers, the way it is, you've got a pavilion and you've got a couple like buildings, and that's where most of the events take place. and then you have a series of narrow roadways where the various campsites are. The first two roadways nearest the main camp area are the highest traffic places, and they're the most desirable places for a vendor to be. And those have historically called those are historically called Agora Alley. And in the past, every single one of those sites was full, and every single one of those sites was selling stuff. Often food, not exclusively. There's also all kinds of other gear being sold. Yeah, I'm thinking of Cantwell. Good, thank you, John. That is exactly who I was thinking. And he'll come up here in a minute too. But Chris Cantwell, yep, that's him. And this year, the organizers were demanding that everyone on Agora Alley pay them $500 in order to have the right to be there. Now, some of the vendors just ignored this and just moved to other parts of the camp farther removed from Agora Alley. Right, there was nothing stopping them from doing this. But it's very likely that other vendors just decided not to come as a result. And the organizers here were claiming that well, they need the money to help police Porcfest, which is not what you want to do for an organization that's very largely anarchist libertarians who don't like being policed, and also to keep out, and then they need the police to keep Cantwell out. And I just think that's laughable, as if Cantwell is some existential threat to Porcfest. He has very little reason to go, but if he did, he wouldn't be welcome. You're talking about a large population that's owning guns and displaying guns and have guns, and there's just no reason that he would pose a threat, even if he did come. So I just find that a ridiculous argument. So one thing I didn't know about, so the years that I had gone to Porcfest, it started on Monday and ended on Sunday. Although usually on Sunday there's almost nothing. There's usually a church service of some type, and that's pretty much it. People are basically getting everything ready to go. Historically, Porcfest was just a weekend, a Friday and Saturday type event, and it slowly grew because people started coming on Thursday and then Wednesday, and within a few years, it was a week-long event, and that's how it was when I came. So I showed up on Monday thinking this was Porcfest. To my surprise, Porcfest did not actually begin officially until noon on Tuesday, and really didn't have any events of note until Wednesday. So what was going on before Porcfest for about a week is Forkfest. The name inspired, it's gone by previous names, but the name inspired by the numerous forkings of cryptocurrencies. So Forkfest is basically a very conscious attempt to recreate Porcfest, because there's no organization. There's nobody running it. There's no officials. There's just people who come and hang out together and do what they want. And I learned most about this from Derek Friedman. So I've been friends with Derek for a couple of years. And when I arrived, he was there, and he had set up a large geodesic dome that he wasn't really living in. It was kind of like his hosting venue. And it's quite an impressive structure, actually, for a temporary camp. And like he said that he was disappointed with the amount of regulation and control that was being implemented by the organizers of Porcfest, who are in some way elected from within the Free State Project. I'm not sure how that exactly works, and I'll get into some more of the bitter politics here in a little bit. But that, you know, Derek is very much a spontaneous order anarchist. Who he doesn't deny that there are certain advantages to organization, but there's also certain disadvantages, and he's quite conscious about having a situation that's decentralized. And so that's what Forkfest is. People started coming early, and apparently it's grown quite a bit from, you know, maybe a half dozen or a dozen people maybe 3 or 4 years ago to now a few hundred, 200-300, something like that, maybe more. They don't really know, because it's not a specific event that you buy a ticket for. You just get a spot at Rogers Campground, and you're at Forkfest. So what's interesting here is that they were planning, he and his partner Stephen were planning on leaving at the end of Forkfest, because Porcfest was kind of old school, like they thought it was stale at this point, and the organizers came to them and said, no, but, and they were perched right at the end of Agora Alley, probably at the most trafficked, valuable real estate for the festival that you can get. And the organizer said that nobody else had rented that space, which I think was very sad. And they just said, you know, it's a shame you already have this this building set up. why don't you stay? And so they did. And I think that's very telling that they had to ask someone to stay because nobody was willing to rent. This wouldn't have arisen if somebody had rented the space or reserved the space earlier. So uh, I think that everyone who's there that I talked to had this feeling that it was being overregulated. Another interesting thing, so they've always in the past, you had to pay to attend Porcfest. The way they have it, I don't know how long this has been true, but at this point, during Porcfest, only Porcfest attendees are allowed in the campground. I think if they have people who stay there all year, because there are people who like to camp there all summer. It's like a lot of campgrounds. They have like some more permanent structures that people kind of use as their summer retreats. But by and large, I don't think new campers were allowed to enter Rogers during this time. And uh, they've always issued some kind of badge, usually a bracelet or something, and they were pretty cool about not really asking about it or anything like that. Um, and the only time they would really get picky is if there was a main event with someone who was more famous speaking, and they wanted to make sure that only people who had paid, because assumably people are paying to bring these people here, right? The fee for entering Porkfest is what's helping to fund, get the rooms and the support for the speakers. So that sometimes, if you wanted to go see David Friedman or whoever speak, you would have to display a bracelet to get into the door. They weren't policed very well. You could get around it quite easily. But that was pretty much the only time. And I would typically just kind of have my bracelet in my pocket and only display it if necessary. But this year, they had, I don't want to call them policemen, but officials wearing these yellow vests, kind of ironic given what's happening in France, driving around and checking and asking to see these bracelets. And one guy came and said, "Can I see your bracelet?" And I said, "Well, I'm not wearing it. I have it in my pocket." And he said, "Well, can I see it?" And I show it to him. And he's like, "Can you please put it on your wrist?" And I said, "Well, you know that I have it, so what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, I'm just going to have to stop you again." And I was like, "But you know that I have it, so why would you stop me again if you know that I've paid?" Which I have. I did pay to go to Porkfest. And he's informed me that last year, and this was news to me, yes, paper please, exactly, Gregory. This is the reaction of many libertarians, even though this is very slight and this is a private property venue. Uh, Slight in comparison to like actual like fascistic state doing it, but it's along those lines, even if far up the curve. But uh, I apparently last year somebody snuck into Porkfest, which is probably pretty common. That happens a lot, um, and and uh, whoever this person was, the last one of the nights, I mean, I heard different stories, but the story was told to me that he tried to jump over the fire uh, or into the fire, and he succeeded in landing in it, and he got very, very seriously burned, third-degree burns all over his back. And an ambulance was called, and that's when it was discovered that he hadn't paid, and not only that, he had warrants out for his arrest. So, okay, this is a pretty serious incident, but not one that I saw any real fault of the Free State Project or Rogers Campground. This guy snuck in there, he did something stupid, and he's paying the price for it with his own suffering, mostly, also being caught by the police. But I said, well, did this guy sue Rogers Campground? Was there a lawsuit? And no, he didn't sue. There was no lawsuit. And I said, did he sue the Free State Project or Porkfest? And the answer there also no. So I'm not sure what the point of this is, and I'm also not sure how me having a bracelet would protect me from doing something really stupid. I mean, it certainly wouldn't protect me from getting burned if I were to fall into the fire. So kind of the metaphor here, and you can see it if you look at any pictures of Porkfest, the main fire pit, which is kind of like the hub, especially after hours. During the day, you don't really want a fire going, and you have all these lectures you can go to. But uh, if at night after the last events, which usually end around 8 or 9, you could some of that sometimes they'll have like karaoke and stuff that goes later, but like the serious stuff ends 8 or 9, and the fire pit was the main place that people would congregate. So instead of just being an open pit, though, they had built like a circle of bricks, creating like this. It looks kind of like that cliche of a well, with a stone tube coming out of the ground. And apparently this I don't see how this could actually protect anyone, uh, but it it's what you would call insurance theater, right? Oil rigs do this too. Like every day on an oil rig, we have a safety meeting. The safety meeting rarely does much to make you any safer. I almost died on an oil rig, though we had safety meetings every day. But it then gives the oil company the ability to say, well, we had a safety meeting, so you can't say that we're being derelict or whatever. And that's selling them short because sometimes you do learn, sometimes they are valuable things, but I think this falls into that category. Now they can say, hey, we had a fire ring, so therefore it's not our fault if somebody does something stupid. Kind of hilariously, one of the earlier nights, in the attempt to build a fire, I think, well, they didn't have the best fire builders, and the fire was kind of smothered. But part of the reason was that the wall of stones was choking off oxygen flow, and so people started tearing the stones out and directly referencing the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a preposterous exaggeration of libertarian hyperbole. But yeah, it's still a funny moment. And it did actually help the flames go. Of course, the jokes that the regulations were choking the free market of a fire, but it was kind of a metaphor for the whole event, I think, for a lot of people. But I don't want this to be all bad. So one of the things, though, that always impressed me, and it still does, is the number of kids. And this might be one of the things that's changed. I think the average age is skewing down because more and more families are coming and they're bringing like children. And I know this is something every time I've seen David Friedman speak about this, and David Friedman seems to genuinely like coming to Porkfest. He only spoke once, and that was on Saturday, and I believe he came either Wednesday or Thursday. So he likes to come and just hang out, and you will see him walking around alone. I guess he's single or his wife doesn't come or whatever, but he just walks around talking to people. There's very often there's people congregating around him, but he does get plenty of alone time as well. And he always mentions every time I've heard him speak about it that there are children there and that there are women there also. That's another thing. And that there's something unique about the Free State Project in its ability to have attracted the opposite sex in a way that no other libertarian thing has ever really done. And the fact that there are families is actually kind of momentous, socially speaking and culturally speaking. And I also recall one of the people in 2016, they have something called a soapbox thing where people get on a soapbox and say whatever they want. And one of the more eloquent speakers, a guy named Jim Babb, seems a pretty serious, intelligent guy from what I know. I've never really talked to him personally, but just listened to him. He's very erudite and logical. He uh, pointed out he was very upset with Ian being kicked out and did not want to attend. And but when the kids get bored, no, I will get into that. They most definitely do not get bored. He said he no longer wanted to attend Porkfest, but quote, his children would not stand for that. Children have a tremendous time. There's all kinds of games that they can play, organized by other children, by adults. Basically, they are roving around, LARPing almost the entire weekend with foam battle axes and swords. One of the guys that I know. Uh, I met him years ago, and since then he's gotten married and he has a family, and this was his first time coming back, and he brought his family, and I met them all like the first day, and the second time I met him I was like, where are your kids? And he goes, oh, they got absorbed into the horde. So like this horde of like children were just going around playing everywhere. But then it wasn't just that, because the kids were also taking they would go to the lecture, so you'd see the older kids, especially if they were like tween and teenagers. First of all, they're wearing like the most anarchist shirts that you can wear. Um, and uh, and um, children participating in war games. I knew libertarians were violent. Oh, it gets much worse, Ben Ed, much worse. And not only that, but they're going to lectures. Where I saw one at a lecture about why Piketty was wrong and why his empirical data was misleading and whatnot. So not only they're wearing the Gadsden flag or school socks or whatever. Most of these kids are homeschooled. Apparently, there's an organization of homeschooled families on the Free Coast, basically the Portsmouth area of New Hampshire, where there's about 30 families with children who are basically all homeschooling and coordinating. So these kids are getting a libertarian education, but also kind of living by fairly libertarian ethics, like yeah, Rothbard. Yeah, plenty. You're talking about like 15-year-olds wearing Rothbard shirts. The ones that I talked to all said that they'd been going to Porcfest for a long time and that they loved going, that it was one of their highlights of their year, that they always had a lot of fun and they couldn't imagine not going. And that it's just this cool event that they really enjoyed. But you also saw a lot of child capitalism. You would see kids selling goods. I'm talking now like 8, 9, 10-year-olds, pulling wagons around, selling refreshments, selling snacks, selling clothing, selling jewelry, providing services. I couldn't quite get a picture, but I saw like a 9-year-old carrying several giant bags of garbage for a fee. And I was going to caption it. If I had taken a picture, I would have captioned it, "Under free markets, children are the slaves of capital." But I wasn't able to get my phone out fast enough. Um, I remember years ago there was like an 8-year-old who would go around and he would offer to take out your trash once a day, and he would offer to bring you a cup of coffee for $1 a day at any time you specified. So you could say every morning at 8:15 a.m. please bring me a cup of coffee, and he would do that. So there was a lot of that going on and a lot of fairly unsupervised kids. Uh, at one point, but their parents are still there, so they're not completely unsupervised, but yeah, kind of roaming around. My friend, his son is probably 2 or 3, and his daughter is maybe 8 or 9. And I said, "Oh, your kids are gone." He's, they're fine. Roving around with these bands. So yes, there a lot of child capitalism, but then the children are also getting exposed to all the libertarian rhetoric and all the disagreements. I will say some of them had very foul mouths. They weren't. I mean, f-bombs were being dropped all over the place, and nobody was saying a thing about it. But also, kind of a more general point, they weren't completely segregated. There was a specific tent called the teen tent where they could hang out, but they typically were just out interacting with everyone else. So if there were certain games that were any age groups that were playing dodgeball, frisbee, whatever, and you'd have all ages playing and taking part. And yeah, very interesting. And I think, but this does kind of change. So we're getting less. I mean, there's still open carry. There's plenty of people with handguns and rifles, but not as many as in previous years, in my estimation. Still a lot of drug use, and what people were noticing, I don't partake, but apparently, weed has always been pretty common, but now some of the other drugs, ecstasy, mushrooms, are getting much more widely used. Um, Mushrooms were pretty easy to get, and they were pretty easy to get. And I won't say too much more than that, but and you still would see, this is probably not necessarily good advice, but you would see drinking with gun carry, guys with AR-15s with open containers. As far as I know, nothing ever bad happened. But uh, and someone did ask, would Cantwell get shot? I think it's very very unlikely that Cantwell would get shot, but yeah, it's possible. Uh, yeah, so it seems you're saying women and children around, unlike normal libertarian circles, where there are other races, non-white, represented well. Normal polls of libertarians are like 95% white. So there definitely were other races there. There were black people there. There were Hispanic people there. I would say the percentage is low. I don't know if it's 95% white, but they're definitely there, including some of my subscribers. There's a subscriber here who's a black woman who I didn't really believe was a black woman until I met her at the fire. Yeah, so they're definitely out there. And she's not the only example. There are many others. I wouldn't put it at a percentage. I would say it's low. I don't know if it's 5%, but yes, it's low. But then there's, I mean, probably saw the same number of black women as black men, which is kind of interesting. But again, that is anecdotal. I'm not positive about that. There was more than one black woman there, so uh, you know, take from that what you will. So I don't know. Like, it, I know it always impresses David Friedman, and I must say it also impresses me. And people talk about the need of having a libertarian culture, and I think that you are getting that at Porkfest. You do have a libertarian culture, and apparently you have it within the Free State as well. And one of the highlights is always listening to Jason Sorens speak. Jason Sorens was the Yale graduate student who came up with the idea of the Free State Project way back in 2001. I think it was originally proposed formally in a Yahoo group in July of 2001. Now, it was not an entirely original idea, and he would be the first to say that. But it was his iteration and his work that kind of got the ball rolling. And I can't imagine what it's like to be him in this scenario where there's this movement now that has, I think that they were saying now 4,000 or 5,000 people had moved, and 24,000 people had agreed to move. So uh, uh, it was interesting though. Sadly, he's been a professor at Dartmouth now for a number of years, and I finally got a chance to speak with him. I said, I date a lot of guys who go to Dartmouth. Can they take your class? He has a class on libertarianism, apparently, and he said that he was not in a tenure track position and he will no longer be teaching at Dartmouth, which is very sad to hear. I think he's very clearly been, he's alluded to this without preaching about it too much, but his ideology is in the way of any kind of promotion. I think that's just absurd because not one academic in 1,000 is going to do something as a graduate student that's going to result in thousands of people moving to a new state and becoming politically active. There are literally dozens of state legislatures who owe their status and their and what they're doing in large part to him, and yet he's going to be treated like some fucking reject. And I think that's uh, one of a very, very clear, not the clearest, but one of a very clear indication on the biased nature of academia. But he seems like a very gracious man and great to talk to. I also find out that he and I both like to hike, so we talked a lot about hiking actually. Um, so what else? There's something else I wanted to talk about. Uh, bu- 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 Kids on shrooms. Yeah, I mean, I actually overheard several of the teenagers talking, and one of them said, my dad doesn't care as long as he's the only one who catches us, and then they walked off and disappeared into the shadows. And that is something that none of the adults around there would have minded. Um, did I get into any confrontations over your sign? Wait, wait, wait. What about, how do you know about my sign? Were you there? So, I decided to kind of make Porcfest an opportunity for intactivism. Now, obviously, I've talked about intactivism on my YouTube channel, but I wanted to do it in real life. And there's a picture of me online. I need to see this picture. Can someone send me a link? Um, it's news to me. I didn't know that. But yes, I have. First of all, for many days I wore this shirt, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised that there's a picture of me online because one of the local news broadcasters came and recorded me talking to a nurse at Dartmouth, Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital. But that shirt proved an amazing way to just kind of broach the subject. It's very difficult to go up to somebody and be like, how's your day going? The weather's nice. Yeah, fuck the government. Oh, how do you feel about foreskin and circumcision? It's just a topic that doesn't come up much. But uh, So yes, I will talk. Let me talk, Gregory. I was going to make a whole video just about that because it is very interesting, but I will talk about it now since you asked, and I did want to cover it. He's asking how did parents and children react. So in terms of people who actually reacted, the hey kid, I will pay you $50 a day to bring acid to me every morning at 8 a.m. Probably not impossible. Some of the guys who were selling mushrooms did have children, so it might have been something that was in the works. Um, we actually another subscriber and I were talking, and he was selling cookies, and these girls came to ask to buy the cookies, and they asked if they had any special ingredients, and we said no, and then we made jokes about special cookies, and they bought the cookies, and then their mother came and said, look, don't please. They're not sure if you're being sarcastic or not. I don't mind them buying stuff, but I don't want them buying special cookies. So, if children ask you, please be just directly answering yes or no so they know better. But no, so everyone who directly reacted to my shirt, with one exception, reacted positively. There were two groups of people. People who would say that, I mean, they just make the correct inference that circumcision, that it's an anti-circumcision shirt, which I guess you can say it's not actually, just says that foreskin's great. But people would say, uh, um, that they agreed circumcision was wrong, and people would give me high fives. A couple of people came up to me and said that they were circumcised, but they had had children and decided to break the cycle, and that they had not circumcised them. And one teenager said that he was ambivalent. Other teenagers just kind of asked what I was talking about and found it interesting. The one time I got recorded, and I don't know if this ever got aired or not. I mean, there was a film crew there, but I don't know if they actually showed it anywhere. I was talking to a woman, a couple. The woman was, I think, a nurse or a nurse practitioner at Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital, which is very large medical complex in northern New Hampshire, right by Dartmouth, the Ivy League school. And they had right there with them a toddler, a baby boy. Looked to be 6 months, 8 months old, pretty young. And she said it was interesting. Her perspective was not strongly anti-circumcision, but just kind of cautiously anti-circumcision. And she just said, "Well, we talked about it." She said she had done them before. That the doctors at Dartmouth Hitchcock did not encourage them, but they weren't intactivists either. So they would do them if they were asked, but they never really pushed parents to do them. That she had watched them, and she wasn't horrified. She said they did a good job, and this is one of the things you get very varying anecdotal reports on this, where some people say babies scream and it's terrible, and you can certainly find videos of that. And there's lots of intactivists who started off, watching it happen. Marilyn Milos is a classic example of this. She's a nurse. They do a circumcision. The baby's clearly petrified and tortured, and changes her life. And then you have other people who say, "Oh, it's not that big a deal. The baby just kind of fell asleep." And there's this whole, well, it's passing out from the pain, and it's not always clear what happens, because I think if they do use it's not impossible, although maybe debatable, but the local anesthetics, if used properly, which I think it's fair to say they often aren't, might reduce the initial pain, which again is not an argument for circumcision. I still think it should not be done. But she was saying that the ones that she'd witnessed, they had not appeared to be painful. That between effective use of a dorsal tap, or whatever they call it, so that they would inject the penis with some kind of local anesthetic and then perform this procedure then. But she just thought it wasn't necessary, and she definitely thought that it was something that her son should choose for himself, and not a decision they were willing to make, even though her husband is cut. And so one of the days I tried a little different tact. I just made a sign out of cardboard paper saying, "Ask me why circumcision is a rights violation." One gentleman smugly told me that it should say, why does circumcision violate rights, as if that was a huge grammatical difference. But that's what prompted this nurse, to ask me. So she said, "Well, tell me why." And my kind of recited answer was that the removal of healthy functional tissue for cultural or religious reasons or compelling medical necessity does not fall within the fiduciary rights responsibility of a parent. Parents can make all kinds of decisions for their children. This is unavoidable practically and ethical in many situations, but removing healthy tissue because of what you think it will look like or perceived social conditioning is wrong. So it was interesting. She said that she goes, "Okay, that makes sense to me." I think that she wasn't entirely on board. I think she does believe parents have the right to do it. It's just the decision she decided not to do, which I'll take. Good for her son. He's going to be fine as a result, thankfully. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. But many people, I think there's a selection bias here. People don't want to be confrontational. So there are definitely circumcised people there, and there are definitely parents there who circumcise their kids. And they definitely saw my sign, and they didn't say anything. Um, uh, so none of the. Sometimes I got looks where they read the sign and then just didn't say anything. The only guy who argued with me there was a guy there selling gold and silver who was Jewish, and he just it was kind of interesting. He said, "I can't make an argument for it. I don't have a principled argument. I'm just going to say." He said that Rothbard said everyone's allowed one exception. He goes, "This is my one exception. That this is important to the religion of Judaism, and therefore it should be allowed." And my retort was, "Well, there are many Muslims who sincerely believe for religious reasons that they should circumcise their daughters." And he said he was kind of surprised. You could see the shock in his eyes and the kind of the, you kind of got me. But then he said, well, as long as the, and we got into how there's different ranges of female circumcision, and basically said any kind of female circumcision that is less invasive or as invasive as male circumcision should be allowed. And this has kind of been where the debate has been heading for a while. People who are strongly favor circumcision are going to allow female circumcision rather than seek to restrict male circumcision. The AAP is going along this route, it seems like, and pro-female circumcision organizations are using this logic and this argument to make inroads into intactivism. So that was his line, and then we weren't able to go any further because David Friedman showed up to buy some gold coins, and I knew that my debate with him wasn't going to trump that, so I moved along. But yeah, he was the only person who really argued with me, and so yeah, he was the only one who argued with me. He ended up saying he had no argument. He was just going to make an exceptional claim without evidence, and that he would actually he would tolerate female circumcision up to anything as invasive as male circumcision, but not more, for totally arbitrary reasons, obviously. And I wasn't sure he was Jewish until Friedman showed up, and then he asked him if he asked him if he was an atheist, and said, well, even though that you are, would you like to take part in some kind of Jewish ceremony later today? Which I don't remember if he said yes or no. Friedman definitely saw my sign as well. He didn't vouch to say anything, which I don't take to mean anything, because I think he just wants to do his own thing and doesn't want to debate all the time. I don't tolerate that kind of mealy-mouthed answer. People like that, nurse, are not our allies. Well, I think that's not the best answer she could have given, certainly, but she did not circumcise her baby, and she's not pushing other people to circumcise their babies. So that is a big step in the right direction. And for purely utilitarian reasons, I don't know if we can do better than that right now, because if she were to say, I refuse to do it, it's wrong, I guess that would be that. There's a chance that she could dissuade someone from having it done, but nowadays that just means they'll just go to somebody else. But yeah, she said that the doctors there don't think that it's necessary, and they don't encourage people to do it. And I think this is likely happening because the rates are falling. They're not just falling because of Latino immigration, they're falling among whites as well. So I think that's what we have going on. So let's see. So no, and then the last night, and then, okay, so I said there are two broad groups: people who wanted to say they agreed and they supported it, and then there were basically intact men. There were a couple of men who said, "Oh, I love my foreskin and it's great," and then they kind of would assume that I was as well, and so those are the two groups. There are plenty of guys from Maine there, so there actually are a lot of intact men at Porcfest, as it turns out, and one. One British guy was just and he was so shocked at circumcision, which he was aware of, and he just started ranting about how great it is to have a foreskin, that he without any kind of subtle manipulation on my part, whipped it out to show everybody, which was quite a treat. He was also fairly drunk at the moment that happened, so yeah. Now I also, Gregory Malchuk, this will come in to you. So Gregory Malchuk runs a what do you call it? What's the term? A Discord that's about foreskin, and foreskin restoration and anti-circumcision intactivism, which I've been on a few times. And he told me that he got invited to Porcfest, and then it didn't work out. I'm not sure if I remember the story correctly, but at one point, one of the organizers. Not circumcised does not win you an award. You have to accept the central premise that circumcision is genital mutilation and violates the basic human right of physical. Well, sure, she doesn't win an award, but who cares if she doesn't win an award, right? I don't care. Like, so she's not a hero. She didn't circumcise her kid. She made the right choice. That doesn't make her a hero. I'm not saying she's a hero. I'm saying that she made the right choice with her son, which you would agree that she did. There's a kind of a leap there, because she may still think that parents have the right to do it, and she just decided not to as her parent. That's not the best, I agree, but that's not the worst either. And I think that reasonable people can disagree on what parents are allowed to do. I strongly feel that circumcision is not a choice parents can make. Bitcoin motorists. Okay. Ah, I did talk to Bitcoin motorists then. Okay. Uh, that is not the story I was told, Gregory Malchuk. So Bitcoin motorists is, I don't know if I think he is an organizer of Porkfest, but he was kind of the moderator whenever he would introduce whoever was about to speak in the main pavilion. So he would say, "Oh, coming up, we have so and so." Yes, I do use Discord, and uh, he came up to me when I was wearing my sign, and he said, "Hey, are you the man who was wearing the foreskin shirt?" And I said, "Yes." There was no one else who was wearing a foreskin shirt and walking around with an anti-circumcision sign. And he said that he was an intactivist and that he had tried to invite an intactivist there, and he mentioned you by name, Gregory Malchuk, uh, because of your idea of culture hacking, which you and I talked about a little bit in the Discord. And then he said, and this is what he said, so I'm not saying this is true, but and you may have a different side of the story, which it sounds like you do, but he said that he uninvited you when he found out you were a white nationalist. I don't know if that's true, and you're saying here that you were ill, so he could be misrepresenting that, but that is the story he told me. Uh, and I said, well, definitely not a white nationalist. I would not have given a presentation on culture hacking, whatever the merits or demerits of that are. I just would have made the argument that circumcision is an issue that libertarians have something to say on. And here's something a point I do want to make. Libertarians have debated and talked theoretically and in abstract ways about all kinds of really important issues. Coercion, religion, uh, politics, what should be a crime, what should be a tort, what are the obligations of a parent to a child, what are the rights of a child vis-a-vis the parent. And this has given libertarians a lot of really insightful points of view on things like, say, abortion. And that's why you see a lot of left-wing people, for instance, using libertarian arguments like the evictionist argument when they talk about abortion. The right and the left have been really bad about actually having coherent ideologies and well practiced debated points of view. They just don't. They have rhetoric, they have posturing, and they have feels. Now, right wingers have been basically all the pith, all of the substance of their arguments against the left come from libertarians, almost without exception. I can think of a few, but they're very rare. The left also borrows from the libertarians because there's just many of their arguments for abortion are just so sycophantically stupid that they just don't stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever. So they've been using, like the evictionist argument, which surprises me. Libertarianism has a lot to say, a lot it could add to the circumcision debate. Now, it's a debatable issue, even among libertarians, but it's something that we have a lot to offer to it. And I will say that overall, the tenor at Porcfest was very, very strongly anti-circumcision and for intactivism. Um, and I think that, a parent saying that it's his body, his choice, but that's at the discretion of the parents is a lot better than saying it's not his body, it's not his choice. And so, okay, so I never got any disinvitation. He said I could attend as long as I didn't cause openly disparage libertarianism, which I was totally willing to do. Can't travel because I'm sick all the time. Okay, well, that sounds like that could be a misunderstanding on his part, so I'm not going to say that he obviously lied about it, since those are kind of similar. Uh, but that's not what he said. So I did talk to him though, so he obviously was very much on board with it. And several other people came up to me and said, "Oh, I want to talk to you on, what's your opinion on this?" Sure. I mean, we look, Greg. I mean, this is like the guy in the Discord the other day who was getting furious at the term foreskin restoration, right? Who just thought that using that term was so totally wrong, and I don't think that that's correct. Um, yeah, I'm not seeing any links if people have them, but again, what you can do is post it in the comments of the video after the video is posted, and then I will see it. This is the first I'm hearing about it, so thank you for telling me. Um, so Yes, the members, the people who spoke were very much in favor. And actually, the last night around the fire, which is kind of like the last real event of Porkfest, um, I was talking to some friends, and then I overheard over my shoulder the word foreskin. And there was a group of maybe 6 or 7 people who had formed a circle who were discussing the topic, and I totally butted it and said, "Oh, I'm that guy." And every single person there was like, "It's totally wrong." And some people said I was a hero, which I think was very hyperbolic, but said that circumcision is wrong. And as soon as you started talking about foreskin, it's very interesting. People don't like to talk about it, but when they start talking about it, they get real personal real fast a lot of the time. Guys will often start talking about it, and it's clear that it's something that many of them think about but never express. And I think that that shirt, which, by the way, this shirt, I got this shirt on intaction.org, and I think that this shirt was just an amazing catalyst for starting conversations. And people who ask are willing to listen, and it went better than I thought. Now I'm sure there was selection bias. I'm sure there are people who have their kids circumcised and who maybe resented the implication, and they just didn't want to argue it, and so selection bias, totally understood. But among people who were willing to debate it, the only guy said he wasn't even willing to debate it, that he couldn't make an argument, and he was acknowledging that it was just an exceptional case in his mind, and one that he was special pleading, right, because he clearly wouldn't allow a religious exemption to lots of stuff. One marginally less circumcision doesn't count as a victory in my eyes. Well, I disagree, and that boy is going to disagree. Building the culture and social consensus that will contribute to the ban and funding of foreskin regeneration is a success. Well, I think that you're wrong in saying that decisions like that don't help build that culture, because that's one more boy who is not going to believe all the shit about circumcision. That's one more family who did not believe the shit about circumcision, and who, if asked, are going to basically say, well, we didn't have it done, and this is why. So that is a victory. Now, it's not the greatest, most strategic victory possible. I wish everyone was an intactivist, but that's not going to happen. I think he's doing a good job. Um, so yeah, I may do another video all about the intactivism stuff, but it was good. So people asked, I did see Dave Smith. His comedy routine is kind of very similar to what you saw on the show. I think it was recorded on a show and broadcast, and uh, he is funny and entertaining. I think he, again, has some kind of weird hang up about Justin Amash. He was talking to Jason Sorens, and Sorens mentioned Amash, and then Smith went into like a 5-minute tirade about how Amash is like some horrible hypocrite because he's in trying to impeach Trump for the wrong reasons, right? Smith thinks Trump should be impeached for like the war in Yemen, for instance, and a whole bunch of other war crimes, and that this whole nothing burger of the Russian investigation is ridiculous, which I agree with, and they're trying to impeach him on that somehow is hugely diminishing of Amash. I think that's totally unfair, but it's kind of awkward because he was supposed to be talking to Sorens and just went to this tirade, and Sorens is too quiet and polite to interject. And at the end, you could even tell Smith even apologized for going off the wall. I did not get a chance to talk to him. He was swarmed by people after, and I have an aversion to just clinging on to like celebritarians. I don't like going and being like a barnacle to go latch on and try and get my 2 cents in or try and impress them or do anything. I just find that so demeaning that I just can't bring myself to do it, however interested I might be in talking to somebody like that. You always see people, whether it's David Friedman or Ben, whoever's speaking, there's always people who follow them around, Jeffrey Tucker, and I think that's impolite to them, right? I think that sometimes they just want to enjoy the event and they don't want to be accosted by people who want to whatever make declarations or ask them questions. And I so no, I did not. He was only there for one night, I believe, and he's at the end of the day, he's a New York Jew. We agree on politics, but I don't think New Hampshire's for him, and he'd be the first to do that. Um, uh, so no, Nicholas Sarwark. Okay, Nicholas Sarwark was there, and I watched a couple of his talks, and he just strikes me as a really egotistical, um, vapid person. He several times called out Tom Woods and criticized him in really pathetic ways, and yeah, I don't have much to say about him. I mean, he's kind of like he wore a shirt saying that that he's a great guy because he won he's the chair of the Republic or the Libertarian Party. Like that's some tremendous victory. So no, I didn't make fun of him to his face. I don't know him well enough to do that. I don't have a personal beef with him. Just some of his behavior has struck me as really I'm very people know I listen to Tom Woods, and so obviously my perspective is going to be most influenced by him on that matter. So no, I didn't talk to him. He was there I think almost all week though. Uh, bu- 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 So what else? What else? What else? Oh, I got a new pillow. Actually, a pair of pillows. These were nice. Um, Made by the girlfriend of a subscriber to this channel. So if they happen to watch, thank you. It's a nice pillow. It's already on my couch. My roommate got a chuckle when he saw him. Let's see. Also, not to. I mean, not to go back to the intactivism, but yeah, there were many conversations that happened as a result of that. And one of the most sincere, I met a guy, a straight guy, girlfriend, great guy, seemed really interesting. Free state. Well, he's from New Hampshire, but is an anarcho-capitalist, is active in the Free State Project. And he said, "Well, I have a perspective on here. You want to hear it?" And I said, "Of course." And he was his parents left him intact. They thought that was should be his choice, and he was never made fun of or anything like that. But he knew that he was different, and he felt insecure about it. And he decided to get circumcised when he was 13. He asked his mom if it could be done, and she said yes. And uh, he told me that before it even happened, he was thinking in his mind about jokes he could tell to his friends to kind of allude to the fact that he was now circumcised. He didn't tell me what they were. I doubt he would remember because this was more than 10 years before. But and I said, it sounds like I mean, that you were really looking for some social proof here, and you wanted to, show that you had conformed and that you no longer different. He was absolutely thinking that's exactly what happened. And he said that he regretted it immediately. It did feel like the, the whole most sensitive part of his penis was gone. That like if right now if you're cut and you get all of your sensation or most of your sensation from your head, it would just be like your head got cut off and that was just not there anymore. Um, and he said he regretted it a lot. Dear, so with him, we ended up talking about restoration, and there were a lot of guys who were pretty interested in restoration, so that came up quite a few times. I was actively restoring during most of this wearing a knee brace, and so we talked about that. So yeah, you have a lot of conversations like that, and yeah, I mean, I remember one mom just rolled her eyes. She goes, "Doesn't apply to me. I didn't cut my baby," So um, yeah, but I think that libertarianism has a lot to offer uh, intactivists, and I also think that uh, there's a lot of intactivists who would become libertarian. I think there's a lot that have done that listening to my channel. Maybe not Gregory Melchick, uh, but many others. So uh, that was. I think I will do a video just about the intactivism because this was the first like real life intactivism that I ever did, and it was interesting. The moment, not so much with the shirt, but as soon as you put that sign on, it's a very interesting feeling because people are going to see it and they're going to read it. When you have a sign like that, people just it's crying out for attention, right? Explicitly so, and when you walk, people see it, and they're going to say something. Hit a restoration milestone this week. C4 to C7. What does that mean? Does that mean you are a C4 or that you're a C7? That's because that's a big difference. Um, so, is there anything else I wanted to talk about vis-a-vis Porcfest? Hmm. No, C4 or C7, that is a metric, if that's not a joke, which I can't tell sarcasm through here. Uh, that is a description of how much foreskin you have. A C1 is basically a tightly circumcised individual. C1 is like a tight cut, and then it goes all the way up to I think a C10. A C10 means that you have not only do you have full coverage when you erect, you have overhang when you're erect. And so a C4 is someone who is kind of covering the top of the head some of the time. A C7 is basically covering the head most of the time, completely. So that's a big difference between those two. Um, the woman who rolled her eyes despite keeping her children intact is part of the problem. She fundamentally disagrees that boys have a basic human right to physical integrity. Greg, I don't know how you can infer that based on her reaction. Um, so I feel like that's a well they don't have as much zeal as I do, and so they're wrong or whatever, and I don't agree with that. I'm glad she didn't circumcise her baby. She's not going to tell other parents that they should, even if she says that maybe they have the right to, which I don't know. I can't infer that she even believes that based on what she said or did, right? She gave too scanty evidence there. So you could be right, you could be wrong. She didn't say enough. This is like there's lots of people who passed me and didn't say anything. Would you conclude, well, they unless they said I'm affirm that you are correct and that circumcision is wrong and should be banned, that they must therefore believe those things? I don't know. I don't see how you can rationally come to that conclusion. Um, so no. Uh, she didn't cut her son. She won't cut her future children. So you know she hasn't committed a rights violation, and it's not a rights violation to. She's not obligated to fight on the behalf of other people's rights, and maybe that's where my libertarianism distinguishes me from you. But I don't think people have an obligation to be intactivists. Rolling the eyes came with a lot of baggage, the way I interpret it. Yeah, but what baggage? You know, you can say someone has baggage, but you don't know what's packed in the luggage, right? And you're kind of saying that you know what it is, right? She could just say, maybe, I mean, it's entirely possible that she's just really familiar with intactivism. She's heard about it enough that she's like, oh, here we go again, because she knows that that's not even saying that she disagrees necessarily. You might be right, but you also might be wrong. That's all I'm saying. I don't think that you can infer such a specific thing based on what she said or what she did. And I also think that you are underselling, a nurse saying this is not necessary. We didn't do it to our son. She's not going to encourage anyone else to do it. And absolutely, we need more intact men in this society, and who are willing to speak about it. Yeah, but aggravation and displeasure isn't disagreement necessarily, right? Like I agree with, like I can roll my eyes at libertarians when they voice things I agree with, just because it can be tiring, or it can just be annoying if it gets restated over and over and over and over and over again. So you might be right, but you also could very easily be wrong, and we just don't know. All right. Yeah, the AAP says it's not necessary, but they also say that the benefits outweigh the risks, which is not something this nurse believed, obviously, because she didn't do it. Um, so she was willing to talk to me. She heard me out. She didn't say she disagreed. She is not like most. She's look. She's better than 90% of the parents of the 20th century, right, for making the choice that she did. So I'm not going to say she's the enemy or whatever. Yeah, maybe you might be right that she's not a hero. I'm not a hero, right? So that term gets thrown around way too much, and I would agree she's not a hero, but that's not some indictment of her. She might be a hero in other ways. I mean, for all I know, she's a nurse. For all we know, she saved 20 people's lives, right? I don't know. That could be. So, her intactivism doesn't make her a hero, or lack thereof. So, that's true, but that's not like an indictment of her. So, all right. Listen, I got to go to jiu-jitsu class in a little bit here, but if there are any final questions, let's get them out. What tactics do you use to deal with being circumcised yourself? Do you think these tactics can help other circumcised men dealing with the suffering of being genitally mutilated? Yeah, so number one, restoration. It's one of the few things uh, that you can do, and so you should do it. Right? It's very bad. It's very bad to be frustrated about something and not doing anything about it. So that's number one. And number two is being willing to talk about it and be open about it. And that doesn't mean that you broadcast it to everyone, right? You can't just start screaming about foreskin to every random person, but when you see the openings, or when the openings come, you got to be willing to have a discussion about it. And that can be very cathartic, and then restoration can be very cathartic. So I think that's what people should do. I have a question for Stephen Koza. If you're watching, how do you know that you're a C7, right? Does it stay C7 all the time, or is it like a temporary C7? Have any women made any legal actions against their mutilators? Any grounds for the men? In the United States, I don't think so. Could be wrong. There was a history of female genital mutilation that goes back earlier, because women were getting circumcised and having their clitorises burned off with carbolic acid, but it was never as common. And I don't know. The practice fell out of favor, but I don't think there was a legal case behind that. But I could be wrong. I plead ignorance on that. In terms of Muslim circumcision, I don't think so. The cases that we have are people found out and prosecuted the doctors, but it wasn't because the girls were seeking the tort. So there have been well, so William Stoll sued and settled for a large sum. Yes, but this was there's two types of lawsuits that have been successful for men. These are when circumcisions were done without informed consent, like so that sometimes they just automatically did them without asking the parents. So people have won on that, and there's also what they call a botched job. Yes. Uh, and I think botches are actually, well, I hate the term botching because it assumes that like there's a right kind of circumcision. Uh, Circumcision is, I think, by definition mutilation. You're removing healthy tissue, and I don't think that it can be done, quote, right. The only time it's right is when it's medically necessary, which is extraordinarily rare, or when it's ethically justified, which is when a consenting adult decides to have it done. Those are the only right kind of circumcisions. However, the law does not recognize that. The law recognizes so-called botched circumcisions. If you have a circumcision that is messed up. Now, the rate that this happens is not well known. It's not well tracked. There's so many different things that can go wrong. Some of the things that go wrong are obvious nearly immediately. Some of them are much more subtle. Like I said, I've met many men who have botched circumcisions and do not know it. Let me repeat that. Men who have botched circumcisions who do not know it. I've met about half a dozen men who had skin bridges. Skin bridges is a fairly common type of botch. They're very ugly. They're very unsightly. They potentially can be painful, although not always. Every guy that I know that had them was unaware that they were related to circumcision. They actually thought that they were, quote, born that way. So men like that are very unlikely to sue. Um, so yes, but that's just one example. There's so many others. I've met two guys who had dorsal slits, or not dorsal slits, ventral slits. So the underside of their urethra was slit open. So they're I don't know that that was called. Neither of those two guys knew why they were that way. So if it was an injury that happened before they had memory, or they were lying to me about it, uh, I suppose there are other things that could cause that. There might be natural disorders that cause that, and there might be other accidents that could cause that. But my best guess is it's likely that those are botched circumcisions, but I don't know for sure. Neither do they. But what is the general opinion on circumcision in New Hampshire? So I will say that there's more foreskin in Vermont and Maine than there is in New Hampshire. Those states have lower circumcision rates than New Hampshire, although there's some regional variation here. There's one town, ironically, called Peterborough in New Hampshire, in central New Hampshire, where every guy that I've met there is uncut. And that seems statistically almost impossible to imagine unless there's something about that town which makes it less common. But by and large, New Hampshire is a wealthy state and it's a white state. It's one of the whitest states and it's one of the wealthiest states per capita. And so the result is that the circumcision rate is fairly high. It's one of the higher ones in the country. Now it has fallen, so teenagers are much more likely to be intact than older men, men older than 20, let's say. But it's still not a majority, I don't think. I don't have a big enough sample on that to say for sure, but uh, in general, it's still widely practiced in New Hampshire. Like Vermont and Maine are much better. They have stronger French Canadian influences, apparently. Uh, yeah, according to David Llewellyn, who I think I know who you're talking about, is he's like the lawyers against circumcision guy. Lawsuits, even on botched circumcision case, only exceed a fraction of the time, 10%. Yeah, it sounds about right. I agree that the culture needs to change, right? There's too many lawyers, there's too many judges, there's too many doctors, there's too many politicians who are circumcised, and they are like however powerful and authoritarian they may be, whatever degrees they have, the fact that they were circumcised is going to bias them. There's no question about it. There's a reason that it's so commonly used as a ritual because it's a very powerful thing to do to somebody. You are mutilating the sexual organ of a man, which, for better or for worse, is a huge part of his identity, significant part anyway. And all the things we know about childhood trauma, all the things we know about visiting that on others and internalizing it and Stockholm syndrome, all that applies to guys who have been circumcised to varying degrees. And there's something deeply, deeply difficult to you are confronted with the fact that you've been sexually reduced, and nobody wants to be confronted with that. And so it is much easier for most people to say, I'm fine, I feel fine. I've heard that so many times, and they don't want to admit that there's something there. As soon as they do, then they have to admit that they have been harmed, and that's very, very difficult for people to do. And so, and there's some empirical evidence for this. Study of doctors in Canada showed a very high correlation between whether the doctor was circumcised or not, with if they recommended circumcision or not. And so these are doctors who are looking at the same data. And this is something you see again and again. I remember reading a Men's Health article where doctors in Europe, they read the same studies that the doctors in America read, and the doctors in Europe read them and say, yeah, the benefits here are, even when they're not completely illusory, are so small that they couldn't possibly justify doing this to everybody. And yet doctors in America will look at those same studies and find them extremely compelling. Well, it's because they're fucking circumcised. That's why. And so, uh, yeah, David Llewellyn. That's who I was thinking of. And I know I know Svoboda better. Uh, I know who you mean by Llewellyn. In American Circumcision, and he says that basically law is downstream of culture. He takes the Bannon look. Um, are you a blue belt in BJJ? So in my BJJ school, it's the Gracie Academy that's run out of Torrance from Henner and Helio Gracie, and their system. So it's not sports jujitsu, it's combat jujitsu. So we incorporate strikes and the moves, account for somebody being. So there's plenty of times where they say, okay, once you have somebody in this position, you just ground and pound their face until they're dead. Um, and then um, and in their system, the first belt you get is not a blue belt. It's called a combatives belt. So the combatives belt means that you have muscle memory, high skill of, I think it's like 76 techniques that they judge are the most useful techniques. Things like trap and rolls, arm bars, triangle, basic triangle, like side control things, um, you know, uh, uh, double leg takedown, single leg takedown, stuff like that. Uh, and until you pass, there's a test you have to take where basically you have to demonstrate every technique uh, uh, quickly and without any errors. Basically, once you do that, you can get a combatives belt, and only then can you actually start to roll. There's no sparring at all up until that point. It's just technique practice. And then from there, that usually takes people about a year to get a combatives belt. And then it takes usually another year to get a blue belt. So a blue belt typically takes 2 years at my school. Because I went very frequently, I was able to get the combatives belt in 7 months, which I think was very, very quick. But I was going twice a day, and I've now been rolling since December, so 7 months. So I don't anticipate getting a blue belt until probably the late fall. It's possible I'll get one earlier, but I highly doubt it. But I am rolling now, so it's a lot more fun. Uh, uh, bu- 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 Side topic: have you ever seen Sam Harris openly condemn circumcision? I can't find anything on it as you would on, say, Christopher Hitchens. I've only heard him talk about it in the sense that like he doesn't think it's a big issue. Like kind of agrees, but it's not that important, and he hates comparing it to female circumcision, which he thinks are completely different. So I think he's culturally biased on this. Uh, okay, guys, I cannot answer any more questions tonight because I have to go to class to try and get that blue belt. But once the video is posted, I'll try and read the comments, and I might answer in the comments. But you'll have to post them in the comments because I won't be able to reply in a way that you'll be able to see. So anyway, thanks you all for watching, and have a good night. Bye bye.